This world is dying. I've done a ton of research on this and discovered you.
You know this is crazy, right?
Focus Features presents Begonia.
You're in an echo chamber.
I know what you are.
Alien filth.
This fall,
We have 4 days to save Earth.
when the clock runs out,
If you let me go, I have information you need.
the truth will be revealed.
You're not in control anymore. We are.
Begonia. Rated R. Under 17. Not admitted without parent. Now playing in select theaters. In theaters everywhere. October 31st.
With new, gentler scented Clorox disinfecting wipes, clean finally smells as good as it feels. On everything from lamps to ceiling fans. Even on your kid's toy shark. Oh, ouch. Clorox disinfecting wipes. Now available in crisp lemon. Find it on Amazon. Clorox. Clean feels good.
Welcome back, True Crime Army. I am your host, Margot, and this is Military Murder, a show where I tell you cautionary tales involving military members and veterans with the sole purpose of reminding you to remain vigilant always. Hi, friends. I wanted to start off by saying happy 6th birthday to this little podcast called Military Murder. This show was born of my desire to scream from the rooftops to trust no one. I know, it's kind of a dark message, but it's also a message of hope. We can be good people despite experiencing bad things, and we can also be mindful and aware of our surroundings. On this 6th anniversary, I want to ask you for a huge favor. Listen, if you love the show, stop right now and rate the show. This little act goes a very long way for a small content creator like myself. It helps the show move up in the ranks. It also helps to put the show in front of new listeners. Remember when someone first told you about Military Murder? Remember when you wondered, wait, this show has been around for 3, 4, 5 years and I never heard about it? Yeah, I know, that still happens today. By rating the show, you can help it get in front of more ears. All right, if I'm being truthful, in the last 6 years, I've debated whether I should continue with my mission or if I should just abandon ship and do something new. Maybe I need to go back into an office and just do other things. But in my heart, I know that I'm exactly where I need to be. On a weekly basis, your kind messages in my inbox remind me to keep going. So from the bottom of my heart, thank you for being here. This year, I'm hoping to keep growing, and I can only do that with your help. Rate and share the show. That's all you need to do. Love you. All right, everyone. Did you enjoy last week's conversation with John Quiñones? He came on and told us about his new Vanessa Guillen show. I hope that you all went and followed it because it is really good. I got goosebumps when him and I were talking and he told me about Mama Guillen and how she found it in her heart to forgive Cecily Aguilar. I mean, not for nothing, but I definitely choked up. If you haven't listened to my interview with John, listen. And if not, skip it. That's fine. But go straight to John's new podcast called Vanished: What Happened to Vanessa? Let's get into today's episode. Today's case is like none other. It involves a beautiful family, religion, and so much more. Buckle up, Buttercup, because you will want to punch a few people in the face at the end of this episode. But don't. Join me today as I tell you the story of Chris and Sheri Coleman and their 2 boys, Garett and Gavin. Now, let's dig in.
Military Murder is an independent project and is not endorsed by the Department of Defense or any military component. The views expressed are those of the host. The content of this podcast is not meant to be legal or medical advice. Warning, this episode contains graphic details of murder and is not suitable for young listeners. Listener discretion is advised.
Our story begins as a love story at the K-9 training facility at Lackland Air Force Base in Texas. It was there in 1997 where Chris Coleman, a Marine, and Sheri Weiss, an airman, met during training and fell in love almost instantly. The couple was kind of yin and yang. Sheri was outgoing and beautiful, adventurous, and always willing to try new things. Chris, on the other hand, was more reserved. The son of 2 pastors, he was more laid back, staying behind the scenes, if you will. Within months of dating, they found out that they were pregnant, and yikes. That was kind of a big deal, besides the fact that they were about to be parents, which is a big deal in and of itself, but it was a big deal because Chris's parents would be upset if he was fathering a child out of wedlock. The couple kept their pregnancy under wraps. Sheri went to meet Chris's parents, and for some reason, they were not fond of her. But Chris didn't care. Sheri was secretly pregnant, and the only option in Chris's mind was, well, I guess we got to get married. So in 1997, within 3 months of dating, Chris and Sheri eloped. Chris's parents were not happy about the marriage since they did not approve of Sheri, but what was done was done. Within a year and a half of having their first son, the couple welcomed another son into the family. And with everything going on in the world, Sheri felt it was best if she left the military and focused on motherhood and family life, and Chris was okay with that. Eventually, he himself realized that he didn't want to stay in the military, so he also left the Marine Corps after successfully serving as a canine handler. After leaving the military, the Coleman family settled in Columbia, Illinois. The community they lived in was tight-knit, and that was great for the Colemans, who wanted to raise their children in a quiet community with Christian values. Initially, Chris didn't have a job lined up, but with the help of his parents, he was able to snag a very prestigious job. Chris began working as part of the security team for Joyce Meyer. Joyce Meyer was a world-famous televangelist who traveled the world preaching the gospel. So, as you can imagine, as part of her security team, Chris spent a lot of time away from home. But after working his way up the ranks for several years, he eventually ended up making well over $100,000 a year. Now, that kind of salary afforded Chris and Sheri the opportunity to live in a big house and to do amazing things with and for the kids. But Chris's job working security for a televangelist proved to be more dangerous than working for the Marine Corps. Because while he was working for Joyce, Chris began to receive threatening messages about his employment. In November of 2008, Chris reported receiving an anonymous email that targeted him in a frightening way. The email's author spewed profanity about Joyce Meyer preaching BS, and the sender issued a deadly warning. If Joyce Meyer didn't stop preaching, Chris's family would pay the ultimate price. In fact, the sender explicitly threatened, quote, "I will kill them all while they sleep," end quote, referring to Chris's wife and 2 young kids. Now, this was not a typical fanatical letter against a public figure. I mean, it focused on Chris's family, which made it truly alarming. Over the next few months, more threats arrived at the Coleman household, escalating in tone, and then ominous letters began showing up in the Coleman's mailbox at home. The harassment seemed to be coming from someone who was fixated on Chris's role at the ministry. One letter in particular, received on April 29, 2009, was especially chilling. It ended with the warning, quote, and it was in all caps, "This is my last warning. Your worst nightmare is about to happen," end quote. Now, the implication was clear. Time was running out. And not just that, the messages were no longer coming in just email form. Now, they were showing up at the Coleman doorstep. It appeared that some weirdo was upset that Joyce Meyer was preaching the gospel, and that because Chris was the head of her security team, his family was now in danger if he didn't make Joyce stop preaching. Which, let's just pause. What? That doesn't make any sense, and it seems kind of weird. Why would someone go after the head of security? Why not go after Joyce? Or better yet, why not go after one of her sons, who was now an adult and was involved on the corporate side of the Joyce Meyer Ministries? Yeah, this entire case seemed really weird, but nonetheless, it is very scary. And of course, Chris took the threats seriously, because I would as well. So what did he do? What any normal person would do. He reported the threats to the local Columbia police. And it was perfect, because Coleman's across-the-street neighbor was actually a police detective by the name of Sergeant Justin Barlow. And I don't know about you, but I would find comfort in having a detective neighbor, especially if I was being threatened. When Sergeant Barlow heard about the threats, he also took them seriously, so he wanted to help. And after he learned that a second letter had arrived or been delivered to the Coleman household, he had the police team install a security camera at his house that was pointed directly at the Coleman residence. That way, Barlow could keep an extra eye on them during these scary times. And if someone walked up to the mailbox, they would be caught on camera. And listen, Sheri was a veteran and a mama bear. She was not taking any chances. She armed herself with her very own 9mm, keeping it next to her bed for protection, and during the day, she would conceal carry, which completely makes sense. Joyce Meyer even offered to pay for the Coleman family to install a home security system, but Chris declined, saying that Sheri had a gun and knew how to use it. So life continued as usual. The family playing outside, playing catch, playing with neighborhood kids, and they were even planning sleepovers. In fact, as reported by the St. Louis Magazine, on May 4th, 2009, the Coleman boys ran home from their friend's house. They were so excited to ask their parents for permission to have a school night sleepover to celebrate their friend's birthday. But Chris told the boys they couldn't have a sleepover that night. The Coleman boys were crushed, and they walked over to their neighbor to let them know. Their neighbor's mom was a bit surprised that the Coleman boys were not allowed to have a sleepover, and she even joked around about going to their parents to plead their case. But eventually, she decided against it. Sadly, the following morning, everything would be different, as this neighbor's son looked out to the Coleman house and said, "Hey, there's police everywhere."
Optimism isn't sunshine and rainbows. It's fixing things, changing the way we fix things. It's running the world on smarter energy. Because if optimism never stops, then change can't either. GE Vernova, the energy of change.
This podcast is brought to you by Carvana. Carvana lets you buy your next car on your terms. Explore a massive inventory online, filter for what matters, and find your perfect match. Then choose delivery to your home or pick it up at one of Carvana's iconic car vending machines. Every car also comes with a 7-day money-back guarantee, so you can make sure it's the right fit. Buy your car on Carvana. Delivery or pickup fees may apply. Limitations and exclusions may apply. See our 7-day return policy at Carvana.com.
Carvana. May 5th, 2009 was a typical morning. Chris Coleman woke up at 5:30 a.m. He tiptoed in the dark, putting on his workout clothes in an attempt to not wake his wife, Sheri. He got into his car and pulled out of the driveway at around 5:43 a.m. As he drove to the gym, he called and texted Sheri for her to wake up. He would later say that this was his habit. He'd call his wife and tell her to wake up. But on this morning, Sheri didn't answer or respond. The gym was only 5 miles away, and he arrived at the gym at around 6 a.m. He got in a 40-minute workout, and throughout those 40 minutes, he attempted to call and text his wife. But to his dismay, Sheri never responded. He texted, "Are you awake? I know you were tired last night. Time to get the kids up. Hello? Are you up?" By 6:42 a.m., worried, Chris called his neighbor, Sergeant Barlow, and asked him to check on Sheri. He said that he was worried because he had been trying to reach her and she didn't answer. Of course, Chris told Sergeant Barlow that he was on his way home, but he just had this bad feeling and he wanted Barlow to go check. Sergeant Barlow was startled by the early morning request, but with all the threats that the Coleman family had been receiving, Barlow went straight over to the house. Barlow called for backup and arrived at the front of the Coleman home. They rang the doorbell and knocked loudly, and it was eerily quiet. It was a school day, so the kids should have been, ruffling around inside, but it was just pure silence. The other officer was a patrol officer named Jason Donjan, and he walked around the house to take a look, and that's when he noticed something. A basement window was wide open and the screen had been pried off. He immediately thought, oh my gosh, maybe there was an intruder. So he retrieved his weapon and called for more backup. Then the 2 officers who were already there entered the basement window, clearing each room as they walked from the basement and up through the house. As they walked through the house, they immediately smelled something off. It was the smell of fresh paint fumes in the air. And as they walked into the kitchen, they saw it. Graffiti scrawled across the walls, red spray paint dripping, and it covered the walls with profanity. The words read, "Punished." Another wall read, "I am always watching." Another, "You have paid." This was a scene out of a horror movie. Heart-pounding, Officer Donjan walked up the stairs. Still, all he could hear was silence. Then the front door swung open. It was Chris. The officers told him to stay back. As the officers reached the second floor, one officer walked into the kid's bedroom, and all he saw was a boy tucked in bed. He thought, okay, good. Maybe he kind of felt a little bit of relief. But as he got closer, he saw more of that spray paint, now on the boy's body, like around his hands, and also on the sheets. The boy looked gray. There was bruising around his neck, and he was cold, and his body was already in rigor mortis. That boy was 11-year-old Garett. Across the hall, the other officer shouted. He was in the master bedroom, and he had just found Sheri. She was lifeless and naked and laying on the bed. Her neck was marked with deep ligature wounds. Moments later, another officer found 9-year-old Gavin in his bed. He had also been strangled. Upon finding the bodies, the officers, in their devastation, realized the killer might still be in the home. So they continued until the entire home was cleared. Then they went outside where Chris was waiting. It was 6:56 a.m., a little over an hour after Chris had left, and now he was in his driveway and they wouldn't let him in. Chris was confused. Why couldn't he go in? Why were they putting up yellow caution tape? What was happening? Detective Barlow looked Chris in the eyes and told him, "They didn't make it, Chris. They didn't make it." Chris collapsed, yelling, "No, no." He sobbed and wailed. He rocked back and forth. Moments later, he took out his cell phone and called his father, Reverend Ron Coleman, to tell him the devastating news. His family was all dead. Eventually, Chris was taken to the back of an ambulance where he was tended to by a chaplain. The street started to fill up with onlookers. The police chief, Joe Edwards, eventually showed up and he spoke to Chris as well, telling him again that his family was dead. Chief Edwards didn't specify how Chris's family was killed, and Chris didn't ask. And now, this police department had to investigate how a killer could get in and out of this home, murder 3 people while they slept, and how the killer knew exactly when the father would be gone. This is one of those crime stories that really horrifies a community. A mother and her 2 children killed in their home in a quiet community right next to a detective. And on top of that, this was the family of the chief security head of Joyce Meyer Ministries. Everyone was scared. For the first few days after the triple murder, detectives walked the Coleman neighborhood. They were doing knock and talks, and they were trying to see what they heard or what they saw. But a few stayed behind, and they wanted to learn more about the Colemans. And of course, that all started by interviewing Chris Coleman. Was he really the devoted Christian father everyone thought he was? Well, on the morning after he left the gym and learned about his family's death, he was taken to the police station. He sat in the interrogation room wearing his gym clothes, and his neighbor, Sergeant Barlow, and another officer, Dave Bivens, with the Illinois State Police, sat down to interview Chris. As they questioned him, Chris said that he was cold, and they gave him a blanket and also gave him some water. The blanket request was a little bit odd because it was kind of hot and stuffy in that room, but they took note and gave Chris what he wanted. They talked about his background in the Marine Corps, and then they had him recount everything about that morning. What struck the detectives was how odd Chris was acting. Chris Coleman would sob uncontrollably, cover his face, and then suddenly he would stop and stare into space. Then he would sob again. Detectives asked Chris if the family had any enemies, and Chris immediately brought up the threats he had been receiving connected to his job with Joyce Meyer. Those messages started in late 2008, just 6 months prior. Of course, Chris had reported that to the police, and the police were aware of that, but they just wanted to hear it again. And as I mentioned earlier, Sergeant Barlow, who was the across-the-street neighbor, he had heard about those threats through his employment, and he had even set up that camera, which, by the way, Chris knew about the camera. As the interview continued, the detectives asked Chris about the scratches on his arms, the scratches that he was now covering with the blanket. But by the time he had the blanket on, it was too late. The officers had already seen the scratches. Chris was startled by the question about the scratches. And then he said that he got some of the scratches a few days earlier, but couldn't remember how. But he got some new fresh ones that morning when he was on the ambulance. He said he was hitting his arms up against the gurney in despair and frustration, and those must have left a mark. Okay, odd, but okay. Detectives then asked Chris about his home security system. And well, it turned out that Chris did have a camera, but for some reason or another, it was not working that day, or it had been turned off. At this point, in the detectives' minds, Chris had walked into that interrogation room as what appeared to be a devastated father and husband. But detectives' spidey senses were saying that something was off about this guy. At this point, Chris was an open book. He was like, here's my phone, here's my clothes, here's my DNA, here are all my computers, take whatever you want, let's figure out who did this to my family. So detectives ask, okay, so you're being really, really cooperative. How's your marriage? Oh, it's great. Really? They ask. Well, Actually, Chris says, we have been having some marital issues, but we are getting counseling and things have been improving. Oh, okay, detectives say. While they're questioning Chris, you know that there's an investigation going on back at the scene, and they're looking at everything. Detectives back at the house, they're reviewing not only the crime scene, but they also have Chris's phone and his phone records. And they start putting together what appears to be a disturbing picture. It's not a smoking gun per se, but what they find begins to poke holes in Chris's story. And one of the first things that they do is they ask Chris about a woman named Tara Lintz. Oh, Tara, Chris says. He knows her. She's a school friend or a high school friend of Sheri's. So detectives say, what's up with this girl? What's up with this Tara lady? Y'all have a thing going on? No, not at all, Chris says. Well, that's good that you said that, Chris, because that means you don't mind that we actually have detectives on their way to Tara's house in Florida who are ready to chat with her and just ask her a few questions. Now, at this point, I'm sure that Chris's eyeballs are bulging out of his head. He then admits to the investigators, well, I mean, by a thing, what do you mean? Yeah, we have been flirty, but nothing else. Okay, so then we'll just have to wait and see what Tara says. With nothing to hold him on, Chris is released after 6 hours of interrogation. But the investigation continues, and here is what investigators learn. Well. Remember Chris said he called Sergeant Barlow and then hurried home? His phone records eventually showed that on his way home, he passed his exit, drove further out, and then turned back around to go home. It actually took him 13 minutes from when he called Sergeant Barlow to get home, and it should have only taken him about 5 to 7 minutes. Now, remember that Chris said he always texted and called Sheri to wake her up in the morning? Well, he was a liar, pants on fire. He never did that. This day, the day that she was murdered, was the only morning he ever did that. But why? Why was he calling her so much that morning? Later, once the autopsies were completed, the forensic pathologist, Dr. Michael Baden, noted that Sheri and the boys had been killed well before 5 o'clock in the morning. They likely died around 3 a.m., so they were dead by the time that Chris pulled out of his driveway at 5:43 a.m. At this point, I mean, we know, right? We know. But let's continue. What else did they find? They didn't find anybody else's DNA in the house. And remember the open basement window? Well, after they investigated it and they kind of looked around, it just appeared to be staged. And remember that red spray paint with the cuss words and the, you have paid and whatever else was scrawled upon the walls? Well, investigators looked at Chris's financial records, and they found that Chris had purchased Rust-Oleum apple red spray paint at a local hardware store before the murders. By the way, that purchase of the red spray paint, that was made 3 months prior to the murders. That means that he bought that in February. Now, let's talk about the threats connected to Chris's employment with Joyce Meyer. The major case squad got involved early, and what they found would shock even the most seasoned true crime listeners. Investigators traced the emails that were first sent on November 14th, 2008 to Chris and to Joyce, and they found that those emails, those threatening emails, originated from Chris Coleman's very own laptop computer. The email address, which was, by the way, destroychris@gmail.com, that email address was created on Chris's computer on the very day that the first email was sent. Also, apparently, spell check did not exist back then because both the Destroy Chris emails and Chris's own work files included the same typographical errors. So by this point, you're probably wondering, wait, Margot, if Chris killed his family, why? He's like a Christian man. He works for this Christian televangelist. Why would he kill his entire family? And why would he go so far as to create fake emails, file police reports, and then pretend that he went to the gym? Well, friends, I'll tell you why. Another woman. That's right. There was another woman. Now, hold your horses, because this wasn't just any other woman. This other woman was Sheri's best friend from high school, and we have already heard her name. Her name was Tara Lentz.
Rain-X wipers are the #1 wiper blades in America. That means all kinds of drivers choose Rain-X. Big drivers in small cars choose Rain-X. Small drivers in big cars choose Rain-X. Drivers with long hair and short commutes choose Rain-X. Drivers with short hair and long commutes choose Rain-X. Drivers with pets on board, babies on board, and bored babies on board choose Rain-X. Basically, drivers who love a clear view of the road all choose Rain-X wipers, the #1 wiper blades in America.
We all love a legendary comeback, and Degree Original Cool Rush is back and better than ever. Cool Rush isn't just a scent, it's a movement, a fan favorite that delivers bold, fresh vibes and all-day sweat protection. Whether you have a man that spends hours in the gym, heads into the office early, or is just trying to stay fresh on a long day, Cool Rush has their back. Head to your local Walmart or Target and grab Degree Cool Rush, the fan favorite scent from the world's #1 antiperspirant brand.
Sheri grew up in Florida, and at some point, she introduced her husband, Chris, to her high school bestie, Tara Lentz. Tara had been down in the dumps and living in Florida, and Sheri set it up so that Tara could attend one of Joyce Meyer's conferences in Florida, and there, Tara got to meet Chris. Well, Sheri didn't travel with Chris, but Sheri trusted that maybe Tara could get her life right with the Lord. Little did Sheri know that Tara would end up stealing Chris's heart, and Chris was all about adultery. On the day of the murders, police found out about Tara, and they sent a team from Florida to go interview her. Chris initially had denied to police that he was having a full-blown affair. But when police interviewed Tara, she laid it all out on the line. She told them everything. And immediately, authorities knew that not only was Chris a liar, but they now had the motive they had been looking for. Tara revealed that she was having a full-blown affair with Chris Coleman. The affair turned sexual in November of 2008, around the same time that Chris began to receive those so-called threats. If you're wondering when Tara and Chris would see each other, they would see each other during Chris's security work for Joyce Meyer. If there was a conference in Florida, Tara was there. Conference in Hawaii, Tara was there. Conference in Arizona, Tara was there. The couple even exchanged promise rings, and they talked about getting married and having kids of their own. I'm sorry, what? These old, crusty people are exchanging promise rings like they're a bunch of high school kids? Ugh, so gross and crazy. But guess what else? Chris and Tara had planned a cruise which was set to sail on June 14th, 2009. Tara was also looking at engagement rings. She had even registered on wedding registries online, and they even had a date, January 2010. This would give Chris enough time to divorce Sheri, of course. Surprisingly, on May 4th, 2009, which was the day before Sheri and her kids were murdered, Chris told Tara that he would be serving divorce papers on Sheri. But the craziest thing that investigators learned was that after Chris found out his family was dead, he emailed Tara to reassure her he had an alibi and he wasn't the one who did it. But listen, True Crime Army, Tara wasn't the only one spilling the beans, because Sheri's friends had something to say. While everyone looking at the Coleman family may have thought that they were the perfect couple, attending church together, and even going to the front of the church the week prior for an altar call for married couples, those closest to Sheri knew there was trouble in paradise, because Sheri herself had told them. The Christmas prior to her death, which was Christmas of 2008, Sheri showed a friend Tara's Facebook profile picture and said, "Do you want to see the woman my husband is having an affair with?" Word on the street was that Chris told Sheri he wanted to leave her. He wanted a divorce. But he never mentioned the other woman. Sheri, of course, she did some digging. She knew that Chris wasn't going to be telling her the truth because he didn't want to lose his job working for Joyce Meyer. As a televangelist, Joyce had a strict moral code that she expected her employees to abide by, and adultery was a big no-no. Even divorce was frowned upon in the ministry, but Chris still wanted out. Sheri, though, she didn't want to let Chris go. She wanted to fight for her marriage. Sadly, though, whether a premonition or something else, before her death, Sheri told a friend, "If anything ever happens to me, Chris did it." Wow. I don't think, though, that Sheri could have ever imagined that Chris would hurt the boys as well.
I turned off news altogether.
I hate to say it, but I don't trust much of anything.
It's the rage bait.
It feels like it's trying to divide people.
If we got clear facts, maybe we could calm down a little.
NBC News brings you clear reporting. Let's meet at the facts. Let's move forward from there. NBC News, reporting for America.
Even though Chris was allowed to roam free after his interrogation, 2 weeks after the Coleman family massacre, the jig was up. On May 19, 2009, Chris Coleman was arrested and faced charges for 3 counts of first-degree murder. Despite the overwhelming evidence, Chris maintained his innocence and his minister parents stood behind their son. Trial began in April of 2011 with a packed courtroom and the media swarming. As you can imagine, this was a big case. A family annihilator who was the head of security for one of the biggest televangelists of our time? An affair? A crazed stalker leaving threatening letters? Yeah, this was a huge case. Over the course of 2 weeks, the jury heard from a parade of witnesses painting a comprehensive picture of Chris's double life and his plan to eliminate his family. I did go back and read the appellate opinions. They actually talk about every single person that testifies, but I'm only going to include key testimony here. So this is a glimpse of what the jury heard. They heard from forensic experts who explained the computer and linguistic evidence, tracing the threatening messages to Chris's devices and habits. They showed how unlikely it would be for some random hacker to know the intimate details included in the threats, like where he was going to be or what he was doing, or how it would be weird for someone to replicate Chris's specific typographical errors and phrasing. Then there were the police and investigators who walked the jury through the physical evidence. There was the lack of forced entry, the fact that nothing was stolen or disturbed except what the killer himself staged. They also highlighted the Rust-Oleum paint purchase by Chris, the timeline that proved Chris had opportunity, no alibi during the likely time of death, and the autopsy findings that refuted his version of events. Remember, he said that they were alive and kicking at 5:43 a.m. However, the autopsy revealed that Sheri and her kids died way before 5 a.m. Jurors also heard from Sheri's friends who heartbreakingly testified about Sheri's own words from the months leading up to her death. They quoted Sheri's pleas and fears. Sheri told her friends that Chris told her that she ruined his life and that he couldn't get away from her. He also admitted that he couldn't divorce her because of his job with Joyce. The jury also heard how Sheri was actively seeking help. This woman was trying to save her marriage. She was calling pastors. She was calling Joyce Meyer's family. She was trying everything she could to hold Chris accountable and to keep the family unit intact. The most haunting evidence was Kathy LaPlante's testimony that Sheri explicitly told her to suspect Chris if anything bad ever happened to her. The jury also heard from Tara Lintz herself. You might recall she was the other woman. Through her words, the jury learned how brazenly Chris had pursued a future with Tara, promising marriage, exchanging promise rings, even taking romantic vacations with her while telling Sheri he was on work trips. By the way, as reported by Fox 2 Now, Tara wore the promise ring that Chris gave her as she testified. Yeah, this case, or this woman, gets weirder by the moment. Tara explained on the stand the explicit emails and text messages between her and Chris, which, by the way, included video and pictures, and how Tara received a call from Chris's father informing her of Sheri and the boys' death on the morning that they died. Which, what? You mean to tell me that Chris's father knew about Tara? That's a story for another day, friends. Because Chris Coleman's entire family, they're a bunch of whack jobs. Apparently, on cross-examination, they even obtained information that Chris's brother sent explicit text messages to Tara, which is kind of weird. I didn't even have that in the script, but I remembered it from my research. And isn't that weird? Why would Chris's brother be sending this woman explicit messages? All right, so let's move on from Tara. One of Chris's friends even testified that Chris told them that Sheri was holding him back from God's destiny. What's God's destiny for you, Chris? Like, listen, we're all listening. What is it? What's the destiny? That you kill your whole family? Like, really? Come on now. After all the evidence was presented, the prosecutor told the jury they had everything they needed to return a guilty verdict. Meanwhile, the defense argued that Chris was set up by the boogeyman, the person leaving the threatening emails and messages. That person knew Chris's schedule, used Chris's laptop, used the spray paint that Chris purchased at the store, and now poor Chris was paying the price for someone else's crime. With that, the case was handed over to the jury, and while one might expect a quick turn, this jury actually had a hard time coming up with a decision. They sent various notes to the judge. They requested to see transcripts of testimony, and at one point, they even sent a note to the judge informing them that they were hung. But as we know, if we've ever watched a trial, the judge will always ask the jury to keep deliberating, and they did. And finally, almost as if poetic justice, on May 5th, 2011, exactly 2 years to the date after Sheri, Garett, and Gavin were murdered, the jury spoke. Chris Coleman was found guilty, but the jury couldn't head home just yet. They had to determine if Chris should get the death penalty. Side note, the death penalty was still an available sentence at the time, although Illinois was in the process of abolishing the death penalty at the time of Chris's trial. So the jury did find that there were aggravating factors, but before they could provide a sentence, Chris decided to waive his right to have the jury decide the sentence, which meant the judge would be the decider. In the end, the judge sentenced Chris to 3 life sentences without the possibility of parole. Weeks later, Illinois outlawed the death penalty. So what happened after this case? As for Sheri's family, they were grief-stricken, and they filed a wrongful death lawsuit against Joyce Meyer Ministries. Sheri's family argued that Joyce Meyer Ministries was negligent and that they failed to investigate the threats. And we know that those threats, had they been investigated, were coming straight from Chris Coleman. Well, that wrongful death lawsuit was eventually dismissed. By the way, during the trial, Joyce Meyer testified. She said that divorce is frowned upon within her business, but that she considers each divorce on a case-by-case basis. She admitted, though, that had Chris confessed about his affair and actually asked for help, she would have tried to counsel him. However, Chris never asked for help. Today, Chris Coleman sits in prison. He still claims that he's innocent. And his parents, they strongly believe that Chris is innocent as well. True Crime Army, thank you so much for tuning in today. May this case remind us all that divorce is better than murder. Say it with me, everyone. Divorce is better than murder. All right, everyone. My sources for today's episode included 2 appellate court opinions, as well as various news articles found in CBS News, St. Louis Magazine, and Tampa Bay Times. There is also a 48 Hours documentary on this case, as well as a lot of podcasts have covered this case. If you're interested in more military true crime content, be sure to join my Patreon at patreon.com/militarymurder. There, you can unlock over 50 full-length bonus episodes. By joining my Patreon, you can hear more true crime coverage and you get to support your favorite show. Military Murder is a Mama Margot production. The music was created by Ty-Ops. Until next time, remember, you never really know what someone is capable of, so remain vigilant always. You have a fabulous week, and I'll keep digging to bring you another military murder story next time.
podcast. I don't want to.
Mint is still $15 a month for premium wireless. And if you haven't made the switch yet, here are 15 reasons why you should. 1, it's $15 a month. 2, seriously, it's $15 a month. 3, no big contrast. 4, I use it. 5, my mom uses it. Are you playing me off? That's what's happening, right? Okay, give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, $15 per month equivalent required. New customer offer first 3 months only. Then full price plan options available. Taxes and fees extra. See mintmobile.com.